All right, guys, today we are going to be reacting to the real reason no one's won the United States beef or US beef. Very interesting with a lot of things going on right now. It's going to be, it's good to just get a feedback on this regard. Let's jump in here. Let's see what's going on.
Take chicken from America. They won't take lobsters from America. They hate our beef because our beef is beautiful.
The US president has announced a deal to boost beef exports to the European Union.
Because American beef is considered the best in the world.
The Americans basically say, we produce what we produce, and at the end of the process, we investigate whether that food is safe and secure.
There's no risk from consuming U.S. beef.
Some of our scientists, and by the way, some American scientists, have decided otherwise, that there is a risk.
I will not subject my children to anything that is unsafe.
If I wanted to put these guys on growth stimulants or steroids, I could take about 6 months off the time that they're here and get them up to that same weight, at 15 to 1,600 pound range in 6 months less time.
Why can't we sell our product to the European countries?
Wondering why the United States has had a decades-long battle with countries like Australia, Argentina, the United Kingdom, and the European Union over beef?
But they ban American beef.
And why don't other countries around the globe really want it?
They won't take any of our beef.
Well, let's take a look.
I see. This is going to be interesting.
Earlier this month, United States President Donald Trump made it clear he's tired of beefing over beef.
They ban American beef, yet we imported $3 billion of Australian beef from them just last year alone. They won't take any of our beef. They don't want it.
As part of a sweeping tariff reform, his administration wants other countries to import more American beef. Now, this is actually really interesting because technically speaking, there actually isn't a ban on American beef in Australia. The US could import beef at any time if they wanted to. The problem is that they import beef at any time if they wanted to. The problem is that American beef producers can't prove their American beef is American. Yeah, so to tell this story, we need to go back just a little bit.
There we go.
The fallout has already started, as we just heard, shortly after the news of mad cow disease in Washington state broke out.
In December of 2003, the first case of mad cow disease, otherwise known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, was detected in the United States in a cow from Washington. When humans eat meat contaminated with BSE, they can become infected with what is known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Globally, 233 people are known to have died from this disease.
Oh my God.
With this risk in mind, significant international trade restrictions on U.S. beef were triggered, including a recall of around 4,500 kilograms of meat and increased testing and surveillance measures. While the outbreak in 2003 was limited to a single case in the United States, it heightened the potential risk of BSE and its impact on global trade. And rightfully so, countries like Australia and New Zealand wanted to protect their citizens. So as part of their joint organization, the Food Standards of Australia and New Zealand, or the FSANZ, they created a rigorous food safety check system based on the World Organization for Animal Health methodology. In short, any country seeking market access to import fresh beef products, which means chilled or frozen meat, not processed beef products, must undergo this BSE risk assessment. And keep in mind, these standards are put in place to help ensure the health and safety of Australian citizens, and these rules are applied evenly and fairly to anyone who wants to import beef into Australia. In 2015, the USA was actually granted Category 1 status, finding that the US had comprehensive and well-established controls to prevent BSE outbreaks in cattle and any contamination into the human food chain. But not so fast. You see, in the fine print, the provisional status specified that the animal from which the beef was derived must have been a, quote, continuous resident in the approved country since.
There we go. That's the problem right there. We already know what's the problem, right? I think in the last 20 years, the United States has lost a little bit of that standard and quality. We're trying to do a lot of shortcuts, and we can see it even in the labor short. You can see in the farm, a lot of people in the farms industry, they're paying immigrants $75 a day to pick up some strawberries. Man, that's such a disrespectful thing to do. So we became a nation of high standard to a nation of low standard and malpractice. And I'm not surprised beef is here. And not only that, man, me and my wife, we like to just look at the ingredients. You will be surprised how many ingredients are just put into a bar of chocolate, or chocolate bar. I mean, it's like 35 ingredients just to make a chocolate bar. And the United States, it's insane.
Birth, which is actually a pretty big problem for the United States because we import a lot, and I mean a lot, of cattle from Canada and Mexico. An average of 700,000 cattle, buffalo, or bison from Canada each year between 2019 and 2023, and 1.2 million per year from Mexico.
Go. And this is what I'm talking about, more about that cheap kind of way of just moving through life, man. This is cheap right here.
Period, in fact. The Australian authorities expressed that significant of a herd change would require a further science-based risk assessment. Furthermore, Australian cattlemen raised concerns about the traceability of cattle born outside the United States and argued that all beef imported to Australia should be subject to the same rigorous end-to-end traceability requirements as Australian producers. In all fairness, the United States actually does have a national traceability system put in place, but pretty much everybody is in agreement that it is nowhere near as rigorous as the electronic traceability system that exists in Australia. And this is pretty much the exact same reason why Argentina also doesn't allow the imports of American beef. An official ban on U.S. beef has been lifted since 2018, but the country has maintained a restriction on live cattle imports until the two countries can finalize a new sanitary certificate. So there's actually a bit of a stalemate going on at the moment. On the one hand, the Australians and Argentinians feel very strongly that any beef that's imported into their country should be held to the exact same standards as the beef that's produced within their country, which I think is a fair ask.
Yeah, it's a fair.
On the other hand, there are virtually no U.S. companies that are willing to take on the level of tracing that those two are asking for. There isn't a feasible way where they could do that while still making their product a cost-efficient product to ship to such a far-off destination. But it actually isn't just Argentina and Australia that have bans on American beef. In fact, many other countries around the globe also restrict American beef products, although due to a variety of different reasons. For example, the Trump administration has also recently signaled out the United Kingdom and the European Union for, quote, non-science-based, end quote, restrictions on importing U.S. beef. Non-science-based restrictions. What does that mean exactly? Well, to tell this story, we need to go back again, but this time over 35 years, specifically to the late 1980s and one of the longest, most acrimonious standoffs in world trade history. In 1988, U.S. meat exports to the area we now know largely as the European Union averaged 4,400 metric tons of beef muscle cuts and 68,000 metric tons of beef variety meats every year. However, in 1989, again, what we know today as the European Union and the United Kingdom restricted U.S. and Canadian beef imports due to health concerns. U.S. dairy and cattle farmers specifically routinely used hormones like estradiol and testosterone to promote faster growth and improve feed efficiency.
There we go. And you know what's crazy? And you know that's true. And for some reason, that's true. Man, I used to be a pro-farm, American farm guy, but the way sometimes they do their practices, they're not that bad, though. Listen, they're not that bad, but some of them are just... Oh, man. Testosterone, I have to say, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
The EU's ban rationale was, and continues to be, based on its own scientific evaluation showing that daily intake of growth hormones can have negative health impacts, including evidence that estradiol can cause cancerous tumor growth. In 1990, the year following the hormone ban, U.S. exports fell 86% for variety meats and 59% for beef muscle cuts. Facing this substantial market loss, the U.S. cattle industry argued against the EU's restrictions, saying food safety testing in the U.S. shows, quote, no risk to adult health, end quote. and took their case to the WTO for arbitration. Over the next couple of decades, yes, decades, there were a variety of WTO court cases, scientific squabbling, regulatory changes, and tariff threats as the United States and the EU duked it out over beef imports. Notably, one of the more significant arguments from the Europeans was that while, yes, they would concede that the use of hormones may not pose a significant risk to adult health, the entire population does not consist of only healthy adults, but also infants, children, the elderly, and the immunocompromised. Ultimately, the WTO actually ruled in favor of the United States in this case. However, it still took decades for a deal to be worked out. Final negotiations resulted in a new agreement, which was approved in 2019. The principal measures of this agreement was to see hormone-treated beef remain out of EU markets, and in return, for a promise of a higher duty-free access of US beef to EU markets. Specifically, the EU agreed to a raised 45,000-ton quota for non-hormone-treated beef imports, and the US is allocated 35,000 tons of this quota, phased in over 7 years. Which sounds like a lot, and given the fact that the Trump administration held an entire signing ceremony in the White House over this new deal, you would think this was a huge win for US cattle farmers, right? Right? Nope, the EU pretty much got exactly what they wanted in the first place. You see, in order to facilitate a rise in US exports to the EU, the United States had already started the USDA's non-hormone treated cattle, or the NHTC program, way back in 2001. Under this program, the USDA certifies that cattle have never been fed or treated with hormonal growth promotants, tracking cattle from birth through delivery to the packing plant door. This is basically a very similar quality control system to what exists here in the European Union, and basically confirms the fact that US beef producers, if they want to sell to the EU, will cease using growth hormones in the production of their beef. Again, under the negotiations from the Trump administration, it is only non-hormone added beef that is allowed to be sold to the European Union.
And that's it. And I believe a lot of, man, it's like you can tell, you get the feeling that the same thing they do with our food, with our cereal, a lot of our vegetables, fat food. Wouldn't you think that they might do the same thing with beef? Of course.
But it gets
the
even
chicken, the chicken that they sell. I mean, I ate chicken from the farm, right? They're so different from a chicken that you buy in a supermarket with no GMO. The chicken that you buy with GMO, it's inflated. It's way inflated. So
more embarrassing for the United States, because not only did they capitulate to the EU's original demands for non-hormone added beef, but the dog and pony show that the Trump administration put on in the White House, saying things like,
"This is a tremendous victory for American farmers, ranchers, and of course European consumers, because American beef is considered the best in the world."
The reality is that this negotiation impacts a laughably small amount of American beef producers and U.S. beef products. Given the extensive documentation requirements for certifying cattle, many American producers have expressed that this production and certification is really just best suited for relatively small calving through finishing operations, and that cattle transfers would be pretty much impossible to do. And given the costs associated with registration, certification, and documentation, not to mention just the hoops you have to jump through in order to produce beef under these regulations, yeah, most farmers just aren't willing to do it. As of March 2025, according to the USDA, only 14 farms, ranches, or feedlots were registered under the NHTC program. That's right. Out of the 732,123 cattle farms across the United States, only 14 meet the hormone-free certification process, or 0.00001% of farms. Now, to be fair, farms come in all shapes and sizes and production capacities. But even if we were just to look at total output, we're still talking about an exceedingly small amount of beef. In 2022, the U.S. produced 12.6 million metric tons of beef in total, Meanwhile, only about 33,000 of that was hormone-free beef sent to the European Union. In other words, about 0.25%, 0.26% to be exact, is what we're talking about here. And in this regard, I think you probably could make the argument that the EU is putting in kind of a pseudo-tariff barrier by requiring laborious and somewhat expensive documentation if beef producers want to import their beef here. However, I think it's also worth putting this all in the perspective of this phrase. If they wanted to, they would. Non-hormone added beef in the United States is largely sold under the organic label and only accounts of 3% of total beef sales there. Granted, this market share is rising, but conventionally produced beef dominates the market, holding 92% of sales, and grass-fed beef the remaining 5%. Yet while the organic beef is largely considered a luxury item in the United States, it's standard practice here in the European Union. In the EU, livestock are often fed diets that emphasize grass and forage, rather than the grain-heavy diets commonly used in the United States. And basic standards here prioritize natural feeding practices, with many farmers opting for grass-fed and organic feed to produce beef that is both high quality and nutrient-rich. Now, yes, this does mean that the wholesale price of beef here in the European Union is higher than that in the United States, and probably also contributes to the statistic that Europeans just don't eat as much beef as Americans do. But in the United States, we hear this argument often that U.S. beef producers couldn't possibly switch to an organic means of production, that not using hormones would be incredibly expensive and the beef market would collapse.
Yeah, I think that's a cope. They're coping. They just don't. I mean, right now I'm mad. I'm mad with my American farmers. I don't want to hear anything. I don't want to hear any excuses. They're taking advantage of the American people. Man, I don't care. They have to change their practices. I don't want no hormones in my food. If you can, I'm in the position. I'm gonna tell you guys. I'm in the position that next year I'm gonna take hunting lessons just to go get at least a year worth of meat. Because I love steak. I love red meat. I love it. But I just don't trust the American product, man. I just don't. I love my country,
but I really kind of have to question that, because if the EU can do it, why can't the United States? And that brings me to my final point. The thing to keep in mind is that even if the United States started only producing organic beef tomorrow, for places like the European Union, Argentina, and Australia, they don't need US beef per se. In all the countries and economic zones that I just listed, production capacity actually exceeds domestic demand. Australia, for example, produces significantly more beef than it consumes, exporting around 68% of its total beef and veal production. Argentina, ranked, by the way, as #1 in the world for beef consumption per capita, also produces far more beef than is consumed domestically. And the EU, while not as heavy on the beef diet, as a whole is still largely self-sufficient in beef, producing more than is consumed domestically each year, leaving a relatively small exportable surplus of about 8 to 10% of production. It is, however, worth noting that the UK specifically does not have a beef surplus. And I want to make this distinction because the United Kingdom is no longer part of the European Union thanks to Brexit. However, that being said, the vast majority of the imports that the UK has of beef largely come from Ireland. It's somewhere in the ballpark of 76%. But on a larger meta level, the UK and the EU's ability to produce high-quality goods also skews the agriculture and food trade deficit. We mostly export high-value products here: wine, spirits, charcuterie, olive oil, cheese, while the US exports low-value commodities: soybeans, feed corn, wheat. The fact that these have lower unit value is due in part to the fact that they largely haven't been refined into an end-user product yet, which is important to consider, specifically when you think about how production influences consumer spending habits. I've made a couple of videos on this topic in the past, but it's just important to underscore one more time of just how different food production and specialty goods impact the way people shop and buy between the United States and Europe. Farms in the US, on average, are 10 times bigger than in the European Union, and they're able to churn out raw materials, hunks of meat, blocks of cheese, silos full of cereals and grains. But the EU is largely the opposite.
Very small.
A mosaic of small, regionally diverse farms. Its producers are uncompetitive in most commodities, but possess an advantage in traditional foods. For example, the continent has 5 times more geographical indication trademarks than the United States, allowing its farmers to transform simple crops into premium goods. When you go to the grocery store, the produce is labeled loud and proud with its place of origin. Regional goods have special bright yellow stickers, and so whether you're buying eggs, milk, flour, noodles, honey, beef, and beyond, consumers here demand to know where their products came from and prefer to buy local. And again, in another video that I've made on the subject, which, by the way, I'll link all of this down below in the description of this video, this same preference for locally sourced organic ingredients also extends to fast food as well, with major chains like Burger King, Subway, and McDonald's advertising and investing heavily in farm-fresh ingredients with short supply chains. Quite frankly, you're not gonna find US beef in your McDonald's Big Mac here in Germany, despite the fact that it's one of America's largest international fast food chains. By and large, European consumers don't want it. And by the way, that Big Mac, despite having locally sourced organic ingredients, costs the exact same here in Germany
as it
does in the United States.
Isn't that
Interesting
funny?
Food for thought for this week for sure.
Yeah, that's
but I
very
would love to
interesting.
hear your thoughts down below in the comment section.
That is very interesting. I have to tell you, that is very interesting thought right there. The reason I say this is because, they make these arguments about, oh, if we just buy local, it's gonna cost a lot of money. They're just playing games. At this point, it's clear that we can make better choices, and I think we are in a very important time where we can now see a lot of these companies that they make food or supermarket, they don't have our best interest, guys. They don't have it. Hey, shout out to Ashton. She did a very good job. Love this topic. Let me know what you guys see in the comment section below. I'll see you in the next one.